everyone. This is Professor Hall. So today we're going to be talking about explicating a poem. You notice right now I have open the notes for you that are also on Blackboard that you can read over. I'm not going to read through the notes. I just want to highlight one or two things, and then we're going to jump into some of the poems you had for this unit, and I'm going to explicate or analyze and explain a little bit of some of those poems before you go in and write about them. So the first thing here is the definition. This is what you're going to be doing in some of your journal entries and discussion boards, and it's also what you're going to be doing for your third paper. The poetry explication has a thesis about the poem's meaning and about the way in which the narrative and features of poetry contribute to that meaning. You will notice, I hope, that this is very similar to the short story explication you did in the beginning of the term. I don't know if I used that word explication, but that's essentially what you were doing. So one of the things, if you notice, this is from another resource. I've linked it for you here. In your notes, you can go and look at that link to read the whole thing if you want. Analyzing and explicating the poem. It's a good idea to read the poem several times, is what the author of this resource says. For some of the projects, you're going to be reading poems, and for other projects, like your final paper, you're actually looking at a spoken word poem. So you want to make sure that you watch that spoken word poem a few times, and then you can find the words online very easily. Just type in the name of the poem and put words. Sometimes they're under lyrics. Sometimes people put them along with songs. One of the things that she says here that I have noticed in my classes, people sort of have a difficult or a challenge with, is determining the literal meaning of the poem. It's surprising to me, I think, that in short stories people don't pick up on symbolism all the time, but in poetry a lot of people want to dive into the symbolism and figure out what stuff means. But the important thing here is to look at the literal meaning of a poem first. What do I mean by that? Well, before I talked about this poem here, The Road Not Taken, again, it's not on your list of poems to read, but I just want to use it as an example. It starts with, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Now, we talked a little bit about how to read a poem and what this poem might symbolize with the two roads, what road each road means. One is the type of poetry other people are writing. The other is the type of poetry he wants to write. What it might symbolize to the reader is the road that everybody else takes and the road that you choose to take, right? So let's say everybody in your family is a chef and you want to be a musician, or everybody in your family has, all of your friends got jobs right after high school, but you wanted to go to college, or the other way around. Maybe you wanted to work for a year or two and then go to school. So that's the symbolic meaning, right? But it's really important to look first at the literal meaning. What is actually happening? What is he saying? There are two roads in a yellow wood, so maybe it's autumn, and they diverge, they fork, they go in two different directions. He's sorry he can't go down both of them and still be whole, still be one traveler. So he stands there for a long time, and he looks down as far as his eyes can see to where the roads bend in the undergrowth. So he's in a forest. The undergrowth, the shrubs and the grasses and all of that is beyond him. He's looking and peering down as far as he can see. That's the literal meaning of the poem. And why would that maybe be important? Well, what the author of this says is that you need a good paraphrase to see what the poem says literally before you can talk about figurative language and other poetic devices. And I do want to stress that. I think it's important, especially with the spoken word poems you're going to look at for your paper. What is literally happening in the poem? One man is talking about visiting his father in prison. One woman is talking about spying on her boyfriend. A guy is talking about being bullied. A girl is talking about having a discussion with her mother about depression. When we understand that fully and we can kind of summarize it, then we can dig into the elements. And honestly, summary is a really good word for it, because it really is, here she's saying paraphrase. But if you think about your first paper and the way that you had to write a summary of the story before you broke down the parts, it's essentially the same thing that you're doing here with a poem. So then she talks about all of those poetic elements that we have looked at in class, or at least that you've looked at in the PowerPoint notes that I provided for you. So who is the speaker? What is their tone? The tone, again, is how the speaker feels, the attitude that the speaker has about the subject. Usually that's an emotional word. So are they angry? Are they frustrated? Are they happy? Are they joyous? Do they feel anxious? Do they feel worried? Do they feel confused? What is the tone? Who is the speaker's audience? Sometimes that can help, thinking about the audience and asking, who exactly are they talking to? Spoken word poems in particular have a personal message that is something personal in the poem that is part of the author's experience. This is their voice coming out. They're sharing part of their identity with the audience. However, there's also a global or universal, or sometimes it's called a political message, something that they want their audience to know or think or believe. So are they talking to people like them who can relate to them? Are they talking to people who have different experiences? Are they talking to an audience of a particular gender, a particular culture, some people with particular interests? Those are some questions to ask. I want you to look at the themes, the structures. Are there stanzas? Is a refrain? Is there anything that is repeated? How is this poem organized? You can look at the rhyme scheme and the meter. I think particularly with the spoken word poems, it's more important to realize how they're using rhyme to emphasize their points and how they're using repetition to emphasize points. How they change up the speed of what they're saying. Sometimes they talk very fast. Sometimes they slow down. They will emphasize something and then draw back, and listen to the tones of their voice. Diction, what word choice are they using? When you talk about diction, you have to unpack the words. What word did they choose? Why, for example, do they call a sunset a fuchsia sunset as opposed to a red sunset, for example? What's important about that particular word? Some of the spoken word poems you're going to be listening to and watching have rather rough language. How do they use cursing and swearing? How do they punctuate things to emphasize points? Is there any significance to the placement of words? And then some of the other things we've talked about: imagery, metaphor, simile, personification, symbolism. Are the images obvious ones? We looked before, and I think maybe twice, at the guitar players, right? Are they obvious symbols like the girl with the guitar, or are they really more abstract like that Picasso painting where he was in his Cubist movement, everything's kind of pulled apart? And other things too that are not necessarily on it says see the video, which we're doing right now. Things that are not necessarily on the list. Characterization, if the poem has characters. Not all poems do. Some lyric poems are just expressing an emotion. We're going to look at some imagist poems that don't really have characters or a plot. They're just a really brief snapshot. Is there a plot? Is there narration? How did those contribute to the poem's themes? So looking at some of those things and breaking them apart and then kind of putting them back together, again, to do, I'm going to highlight in a different color to emphasize, what is the poem's meaning? What is the author's message to the audience? What do they want them to do or think or believe about this poem or take away with them after reading or listening to it? So, The first poem we're going to look at, I have assigned to you, is My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. I want you to read this on your own, but I also wanted to talk about it because I have found that this is kind of a tricky text in my in-person classes. So, one of the things first to know is that there is a difference in many poems, as you saw in your notes. There's a difference between the author and the speaker. The speaker of the poem is the person telling the poem, and it's not the same as the author. In some of the spoken word poems, not all of them, but some of them, the speaker and the author are the same. This is a personal experience that this author is conveying. The OCD poem by Neil Hilborn that you guys are going to listen to, that is quite a personal poem. It's based on his own experiences with OCD. The When Love Arrives poem by Philip K. and Sarah K. They have some personal things in there where they are speaking as where the poet and the speaker are the same, and they have other things that are really not really them talking, but kind of characters that they're putting on. So that's one of the things that you can think of. Here, the poet is Robert Browning, and if you wanted to, you could go and read a little more about him. The poet is not the same as the speaker. The speaker here, it says at the top, is Ferrara. Now, if I didn't tell you that, you'd be like, why is that word there? Is that like Ferrari, like the car? And then maybe that would cause some confusion. So, My Last Duchess. There's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder. Now, Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts the curtain by I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they darest, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only that called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up a spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, it was all one. My favorite, her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries, some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men good, but thanked, somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my name, my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even if you had skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear, to say such an one, and say, this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be stooping. And I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Would it please you to rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his daughter's fair self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go down together, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse thought a rarity, which Claus of Ingesbrook struck in bronze for me. Now, if I read that too fast, you can pause the video and go back and read the poem again. It is in your Blackbird folder. But let's take a look at this poem. I'm just going to look really first. Let's talk about the literal meaning. We have this guy, Ferrara, and Ferrara is a duke. We know he's a duke because he's talking about his duchess, right? His last wife. So he is, as we find out, I'm going to roll down here, as we find out at the end, he is talking to a man who works for a count. And the count, another person who has a royal rank, like the duke, the count is going to give him a dowry. If you don't know what that is, it's interesting. Sometimes it's used in different ways. Here, it means money that would be given along with a woman in marriage. Usually, many years ago, this would be because the man taking her in would have to take care of her. So he would be paid basically for taking care of her for the rest of her life. It's sort of part of the reason that money would be given. Sometimes it was actually done the opposite way, and a man would give the family money when marrying their daughter to make up for the hard work that she was putting in to help the family. But it kind of depends on the culture. But here he's saying, I'm not making any pretense for wanting a dowry, though his daughter's fair self, as I avowed, as I swore at starting, is my object. So the count's known munificence. Munificence means generosity. So basically, this is a duke talking to a man who works for a count. The count has a daughter, and he is discussing the arrangements with the count's emissary or servant, kind of like a secretary, about how he's going to marry the count's daughter and how he's going to get money in the process, though he wants to own the daughter as well. And in talking to this emissary, he takes him on a journey around his estate. And he talks to him about his last duchess, and he's showing him the artwork that's in his house, and one of them is a painting of his late wife. So this is not her, because she is not a real person, but this is often a painting that is used in conjunction with this poem. So we have, as I talk here, you have a man who has drawn a curtain. There's a curtain in front of the painting. He's talking about his late wife. He is discussing his late wife and her faults to the emissary of a count, and he's going to marry the count's daughter next. So this was his last duchess, and the count's daughter is his next duchess. So that's literally what's going on in the poem. Now, we might ask, what happened to the last duchess? And the answer is that she was murdered. So we have, how do I know that? Well, he doesn't want to stoop to correct her when she's smiling upon all of these things. This problem grew. He gave commands, and then all smiles stopped together. And there she stands as if alive. Those 2.5 lines basically show that that's what happened to the last duchess. So why did he murder her? And what is the author's point in telling this story? Well, if we notice some of the elements, we talked about motif. Motif is a repeating element. We have a lot of the times, I'm going to do a find here. If I look for the word smile appears 3 times in this poem. If I look for the word look appears 4 times. People looking at the Duchess and the Duchess looking upon people. He talks a lot about happiness and blushing, and joy. The word joy is in that section twice. So one of the themes really is the idea of control. And he wanted to control this woman. The Duke wanted to control the Duchess. He was basically unable to, and so he killed her. And the author is kind of trying to say, has the message of the poem, one of the messages, I think there are many here, but we'll just talk about the one. Men really should not control women in this way and treat them like objects. We have a woman who is literally, right now, literally an object. She is now a painting on the wall. And he talks about her in much the same way as here at the end, he talks about this bronze statue of Neptune taming a seahorse. And he begins to talk about Claes of Ingesbruck the same way that before he talked about Fra Pandolf, who's the artist that painted her before she died. So I'm just going to zoom in. I'm sorry. So let's take a look at some of the symbolism in this poem that kind of adds to that theme. Here we have, okay, so he says, you're not the first to turn and ask why she has that look in her eye and why she's so beautiful. And he says to the Count's emissary, Sir, it was not her husband's presence only that called that spot of joy into my Duchess's cheek. So, why do we blush? People blush because they are embarrassed. A lot of times they blush if they're flirting and they're attracted to someone. And sometimes they blush because they always blush and that's just how they look. But here he's saying, she didn't just blush when she saw me. Perhaps it was the artist. Perhaps the artist said her mantle, that is to say, like a scarf, would be going over her wrist. Oh, that's too much. And maybe he touched her wrist. Or maybe the artist flattered her and said, paint can never reproduce the faint half flush dying at her throat. So again, a half flush. It's interesting we use the word, that he uses the word dying there, dying along her throat, as opposed to fading. It's sort of a little foreshadowing that she is, in fact, dead. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. So if we look again, if we do a find, the word spot is here twice. Very importantly, spot of joy and a spot of joy. That thing is repeated. And then we have that she is too soon impressed. Not just by this man's 900-year-old name, right? He has probably has money. He has a name that is important in their society. But she is also impressed by the sunset, a bough of cherries that some stupid fool, well-meaning or flirtatious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode around the terrace. So let's look at the symbolism there. The dropping of the daylight in the west could just mean that she is impressed by simple things, and she doesn't really care about money, and she cares about the beauty of the world around her, the sunrise, the sunset, that kind of thing. Cherries. What do cherries symbolize? Well, a lot of times, even today, they can represent sexuality, particularly female sexuality. So I don't love to use this phrase, but people will say something like, they popped her cherry, or he popped her cherry, right? It's the same kind of thing. So there is, on the one hand, there's sort of something sexual about it. On the other hand, it could just be a bough of cherries that some guy is bringing her. An officious fool, so someone who's not really important, but who the Duke does not like flirting with his wife. All of these things, though, seem very innocent. The white mule she's riding around the terrace. Now, that's the other important thing. This is a man who's incredibly wealthy and who has a wealthy, large estate, right? She's not riding a horse. She's riding a mule. And more than that, it's a white mule. So again, we talked about the symbolism of colors before. White often symbolizes purity. So I think taking those two things into account, she's impressed by the daylight in the west. She's impressed by a bough of cherries in the orchard. She's impressed by she's impressed or she enjoys riding a white mule. This is a girl who likes simple pleasures, and he hates it because he cannot control her or show her how much money he has and how much wealth he has. She's not going to be impressed with diamond rings, right? She's not going to be impressed with big trips to the coast. She's not going to be impressed with a stallion. She just likes simple things. And if she likes simple things that are part of nature especially, he can't control that. He can't control the cherries in the orchard. He can't control whether the sun rises or sets in a pretty way. And he could probably put down the mule, but he can't control that that's her favorite pet. So she smiles upon everything, and he gives her probably empty, meaningless gifts that she does not care about. And here we have that, ranking the gift with anyone's name. So those are just a little piece of what adds to the message of this poem. And there's more here in the poem, a lot more here, but I could probably talk for about 2 hours about this poem and then you'd be quite bored. So I'm going to stop here, and then there's another video that examines the two of the other readings that you have for today. One is Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town, and the other one are both versions of Richard Cory. So look for that, and I hope you enjoyed our little explication of My Last Duchess.